Have you ever really stopped to think about the secret story behind all the stuff you use every day? Your phone, your clothes, even your car. They just kind of show up in the world, right? All finished and ready to go. But behind every single one is this hidden world, this massive global assembly line that's practically invisible. So today, we're going to pull back that curtain on the invisible factory.
Okay, let's start with something like a car. You see the logo, the brand, and you think, oh, Ford made this, or Toyota put this together. But that's really just the name on the back, isn't it? The truth is, that car is a puzzle of thousands of parts, from hundreds of different suppliers, in dozens of countries, all built by countless hands.
So, what if the real factory isn't some building on the edge of town? What if the factory that builds our entire world is actually the size of the planet itself? Now that's the big idea we're going to unpack right here.
To really get our heads around this, we need to step inside this planetary factory and see the hidden network that makes everything tick. So, the technical term for this whole setup is a global production network, or GPN. And here's basically how it works. You have a lead company, like an Apple or a Volkswagen, and they don't actually do everything themselves. Nope. Instead, they act like a conductor for a huge orchestra, coordinating this massive network and spreading out every single stage of production, from the first sketch to the raw metals to the final screw, all across the globe to wherever it's cheapest or most efficient.
And this system, it hasn't just been growing, it's absolutely exploded. Just look at this chart. It shows goods exports as a slice of the whole economic pie. Now, find that line for Asia starting back in the 70s? It's a total rocket ship, right? This shows you everything you need to know about the massive shift of production from the global north to the south over the last 50 years. That's the GPN taking over the world.
But this isn't just a story about gadgets and profits. It's a story about people, millions and millions of people, who are the real engine of this global machine. And it's their lives that we're going to zoom in on next.
So, in the world of GPNs, researchers talk about this thing called upgrading. On one hand, you've got economic upgrading. That's when the companies get better, faster, and more profitable. Simple enough. But then there's social upgrading. That's when the workers' lives actually improve. We're talking better pay, more rights, safer conditions. And here's the absolute key. One does not automatically guarantee the other. Just because a company's making more money doesn't mean life is getting better for its workers.
Now, sometimes social upgrading does happen, but it's usually because workers get organized. Take South Africa's auto industry, for example. The unions there are really strong, and they've used that collective power to win real gains, like pushing back against the rise of temp work. That's a perfect example of what researchers call associational power, basically power in numbers.
But the story can be totally different somewhere else. In huge parts of India's clothing and tech sectors, unions are often weak, or even actively discouraged. And without that collective power, well, the result is pretty predictable. Low wages, zero job security, and a system where every single worker is basically left to fend for themselves.
And get this, the factory floor itself is only part of the picture. These global networks actually depend on different layers of labor that we almost never see. So sure, you have the formal factory job, but that job is often only possible because of an informal economy of side hustles. And to holding all of that up is the unpaid work happening at home, the cooking, the cleaning, the childcare that makes it possible for the worker to even show up the next day.
And this isn't just some academic theory. Listen to this story from a researcher in Brazil. There was a worker in a high-tech electronics factory who just couldn't survive on his wages. So what did he do? Every single morning he had to go out and sell peanuts that his mother made for him at home. Think about that. The modern, formal factory literally could not function without his mother's unpaid labor and his own side hustle.
So the network relies on invisible human labor. But there are other ghosts in this machine too, forces and resources that are just as crucial, but maybe even harder to see.
One of these ghosts is the new digital workforce. You've got these online platforms that are basically matchmakers, connecting thousands of tiny digital tasks to workers all over the world. We're not talking about building a physical product here. We're talking about data entry, content moderation, simple bits of code. The whole thing is often managed by an algorithm, not a person, and it has radically driven down labor costs.
This digital labor is a huge new force, for sure. But other invisible networks aren't built on algorithms or Wi-Fi. They're built on something much older, the natural world itself. Look at this number, 99.8%. That is the staggering, catastrophic collapse in Atlantic cod caught off the coast of New England in less than 40 years. And that's not just a statistic. That's the sound of a natural factory, an entire living ecosystem grinding to a halt and shutting down.
This is a textbook example of something ecologists call the tragedy of the commons. The idea is pretty simple. When you have a shared resource, like a fishery that's open to everyone, each individual person has an incentive to take as much as they can for themselves. And the result is totally predictable and totally disastrous. The resource gets wiped out, and the entire community goes down with it.
And that suffering is not just about money. This quote from a fisherman in Gloucester, Massachusetts, it just says it all. For him, fishing wasn't just a job. It was his identity, his culture, it was a connection to generations of his family. The collapse of the ecosystem was also the collapse of an entire way of life.
So these networks are incredibly powerful, but their size, their interconnectedness, well, that also makes them incredibly fragile. And back in 2020, we all got a front row seat to what happens when the entire world just stops.
The pandemic set off this global seizure in the supply chain. I mean, we all lived through it. It started with lockdowns in China, which immediately choked off exports from Asia. A few months later, that turned into a global shortage of, well, everything. Computer chips, lumber, you name it. Production lines just stopped. Costs went through the roof, and nobody had any idea when anything would be delivered.
This quote from a supply chain manager in the auto industry just captures the pure chaos of it all. The problem wasn't just a lack of parts, it was a total breakdown in communication. People couldn't even get in touch with their suppliers. The most basic links that held the entire network together had just vanished. The invisible factory had completely seized up.
All of these shocks, from angry workers to collapsing ecosystems to a global pandemic, have made one thing crystal clear. We can't just ignore how this system is wired anymore. And so now, finally, there's this growing effort to try and rewire it.
And we're seeing this happen on a few different fronts. You've got governments passing new laws that actually hold companies responsible for what happens in their supply chains. After horrible factory collapses in Bangladesh, brands and unions came together to create a legally binding safety agreement. And you've got global unions negotiating directly with the big brands to push for things like a living wage.
For decades, these global production networks were designed for pretty much two things: to be as efficient as possible and to be as invisible as possible. The goal was to make things cheap and to keep all the messy details, the human cost, the environmental damage, the huge risks, all hidden from view. But that era is ending. The hidden costs are now right out in the open for everyone to see. Because, in the end, these invisible networks aren't just some abstract economic thing. They are the actual architecture of our modern world. They build our homes, they make our food, they put the clothes on our backs. So now that we're finally starting to see them clearly, the real question becomes, what's our part to play in building them better?